Welcome to the overview of the book of Deuteronomy. What is Deuteronomy, and when does this take place? Where does it take place? I want to try to go through a few of those details with you to help you think correctly about the book as you approach it. Deuteronomy takes place on the east side of Jordan. So the nation of Israel is now getting ready to enter the promised land. And it's important to understand the flow of Scripture when we reach Deuteronomy. Everything that has taken place prior to Deuteronomy has taken place from Exodus through Numbers in a very short period of time. From about halfway through Exodus and into Numbers, it's a very short period of time. The people, the nation of Israel, were at the central place of Sinai for a long period of time, but then they were also wandering in the wilderness and wandering for 40 years. Deuteronomy begins with a new generation. And so that's the best way to begin understanding this book, is that this is a new generation of people. They are not the same people that wanted to kill Moses and wanted to replace him as a leader. They're not the same ones that wanted to kill Joshua and Caleb for bringing a good report about the land. Most of this generation who's receiving the book of Deuteronomy, they were not even alive when the nation left Egypt. So everyone that was 20 years old and above at the time of the exit of Egypt, they have all died in the wilderness, except for Joshua, Caleb, and of course Moses. The others have all died in the wilderness. And what that means is that this generation was not at Sinai receiving the law from God. So this means that they needed to receive directly from God His instruction and law. And that's actually what Deuteronomy means. It means second law. So that's the meaning of that funny word, Deuteronomy. It means second law. This is God giving the law again through Moses, like He did before, but to a new generation of the nation of Israel. So that helps us understand who these people are, the setting, where they are, and what is about to take place. They are about to enter the promised land and about to go on conquest. So far, up to this point, there's been a lot of very interesting stories. You just finished the book of Numbers. They've had some interesting interactions with different kings and different peoples. But now it's really time to go take what God has promised to give them. What Deuteronomy is it's a series of sermons. This is Moses speaking to the people, giving them direction from God. It's going to seem like a lot of Deuteronomy is repeat stuff, and that's because it is. But it helps us remember that when we go through the Ten Commandments again, and we go through much of the law again, this is to a new generation. They needed to not just say, our parents received this law, they needed to receive the law for themselves. But also, think of it this way, for future generations in Israel, they would need to see that God cares deeply about every generation following Him and keeping His law. So it's important that God didn't just give the law only to one generation. So I want to give you perhaps one spoiler alert, if I can do that, give you a spoiler alert as we go through Deuteronomy. This book hones in the fourth sermon on blessings and curses, and that's going to be very, very critical in relation to the entire book and to the rest of the Old Testament. Most of what we're going to read in the historical books, when we reach those, and all of the prophets, it all hinges on the blessings and curses that God gives in Deuteronomy. So if you really want to get a good grasp on the rest of the entire Old Testament and really understand the direction and why for much of the rest of the Old Testament, then highlight God's instructions in the blessings and curses. Whenever God says, if you do this, I will bless you. If you do not do this, or if you do this, I will curse you. Highlight those sections, and that will be very important for you to remember because they will come into play through the rest of the Old Testament. Deuteronomy is a very important book. It's not like a flyover book that we can skip because so much of what God does is dependent upon this book and explained by this book. The actions that we see God take in the rest of the Old Testament when they seem harsh are not actually revealing a harsh, cold, unloving God. They're revealing a faithful God because Deuteronomy tells us that that's exactly what God would do if his people reject him. So let's walk through the basic outline of the book. We can begin with the first sermon, which is chapters 1 through 4 in Deuteronomy. The theme of this first sermon is remember the past. Remember the past. That's chapter 1 through chapter 4, verse 14. This is a reminder of where the people came from. The intention is for this to be an interpretation of that past. Here is the what and the why of the past. The people need to remember and not lose sight of that as they enter the land. There is instruction to obey God, and they need to remember the past as a motivation for obeying and following God. The second sermon is chapter 4, verse 15 through the end of chapter 11. The theme of this sermon is be careful in the future. Be careful in the future. Moses recites God's standards, instructions for them. They need to follow the laws that God has given. They don't need to follow the history of their previous generation in rejecting God. Instead, they need to forge ahead. I love chapter 6, verse 4. It says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one." He is the Lord. He is alone the Lord. He is one Lord. This is an amazing statement emphasizing the character and the nature of God. So how do we really understand the book of Deuteronomy? We can understand it in a good sense, I think, by trying to put ourselves in the shoes of that generation. And I think that that's going to help you as you read the book. It's the reason why you should avoid reading Deuteronomy as a devotional book. Don't ask, what does this mean for me? Instead, read it and ask, what did it mean for them? That will help you as you go through the book. The next sermon is in chapters 12 through 26. And the theme of this sermon is the law re-given. So we can see the law, the commandments, again laid out. That's chapters 12 through 26. Remember, this is for a new generation. They needed to receive this law from God through Moses, just as the previous generation had. So these people were accountable to God in the same way that the previous generation was accountable to God after leaving Egypt. But it also shows that God cares deeply about every generation of his people. He cares that they follow and love and obey him alone. The next sermon is chapters 27 through 30. Chapters 27 through 30. And the theme of this section is blessings and curses, as I've mentioned before. Blessings and curses. So this is an extremely critical section. Pay very close attention. We see a God that has no neutrality in respect to the law. You must accept it or you must reject it. But I want you to notice a simple formula as you go through this section. Here's the formula. If you obey, there's blessing. If you disobey, there are curses. It's a simple formula to remember. Their curse would be exile. Specifically, God talks about their curses being other nations overtaking them. And you see that spelled out clearly in this portion of Deuteronomy. Really fascinating. This is before they even take control of the portions of the land that they took control of. And that's exactly what happens later on. These curses of other nations coming against them and overtaking them come to pass. And that explains the exile that we see later on in the Old Testament. So very interesting to note as you go through there. Then the final section of the book of Deuteronomy is chapters 31 through 34. Chapters 31 through 34. The theme here is Moses' farewell. Moses' farewell. This is the end of the part of the story where we see Moses. Joshua is the successor of Moses, and there's the commission to him to be strong and courageous. There's the song of Moses, the death of Moses there at the end of the book. And from that time forward, with all of that law giving, with all of those important reminders and words from God, this new generation saw God like no generation had ever seen him, with incredible miracles as they entered the promised land. They witnessed and were affected by his hand of power in some of the most amazing ways that we'll read about in the book of Joshua. But as we close, with all of this excitement for this generation, I want to point out one really interesting nugget from the book of Deuteronomy. And this is a favorite section of mine, and it's an important section because it's going to affect some of the things that we see later. And that's in Deuteronomy chapter 17. A lot hinges on this. It's very interesting to note in all of these instructions from God being re-given to the people, we find Deuteronomy 17, verse 14, the following words. When you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me, you may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. Really significant. Before they go into the land, God makes a provision where he's going to allow them to actually have a king. So we see that here, and then look at his instructions. He doesn't just say you can have a king. He gives instructions for that king. He says, one from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother, only he must, and this is where it gets really interesting, he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to him, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. So this is all of the no-nos. And you're already thinking, Solomon, and you're exactly right. You're exactly right. These are all of the don'ts, and Solomon did a lot of these. But in verse 18 of Deuteronomy 17, God begins to give the list of do's. Here's what the king should do. It says, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes, and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, that he may not turn aside from the commandment either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom. Listen to this, he and his children in Israel. So interesting. Who does that automatically make you think of? Who loved the law? David. He loved it. We read about that in the Psalms, Psalm 19 and Psalm 119. David seems obsessed with the law. Very interesting. I'm not going to get into that here. But these instructions become a defining criteria for all of the kings that we're going to see in Israel, and as the kingdom split in Israel and Judah. So we need to remember Deuteronomy 17 in the days ahead as we go through those portions of Scripture. We can use this passage as a template to decide who's a good king and who's a bad king. And we'll really only see a few good kings. But one king stands out. One king stands out because he most closely aligns with Deuteronomy 17. And God makes a special covenant with that king. We'll see that when we get to 2 Samuel chapter 7. So I trust that reading the book of Deuteronomy, it will be rich for you. And I hope that this video helps frame your thinking a little bit as you approach the book. And I hope that you learn much about the faithful God who was faithful to call a new generation to follow and obey him.